Good morning to all of you who are in the Zoom room right now, and especially to this wonderful committee. We are gathered here today. Let me put my deep voice in. We are gathered here today to witness the defense, Damariye Smith defense of his dissertation. And with us are the committee members. First, Antonio de Velasco, Dr. de Velasco, University of Memphis, of course, Communication Department, Dr. Catherine Hendricks, and then Dr. Stephen L. Nelson. And of course, all of you who are part of this community. We thank you for being a part. We thank you for joining in on today and to witness this wonderful, wonderful occasion. And we are about to get started formally as I turn it over without much further ado, turn it over to Damariye Smith. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm Andre Johnson. Yeah. I want to turn it over to Damariye Smith. I think I have given you permission to share your screen if you like. And so you have roughly about 15 to 20 minutes to present your dissertation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Can everybody see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up. Yes. Okay, perfect. All right, so the title of my dissertation is The Anatomy of the Commencement Speech, an examination of Barack Obama's rhetoric delivered at HBCUs. And so just kind of give an overview. We're going to start off with giving a little bit of historical context about HBCUs. I'm going to introduce the topic in which I engage in, talk about what the issue is in which I address in the dissertation, talk a little bit about the rationale for the study. So again, why study this particular topic, my particular response and how I wanted to address it, my research questions, the methodology in terms of how I go about understanding this topic. I'm going to cover the findings, the implications, and then after that, I'll conclude. And so obviously this was a lengthy study, so I'm really going to cover mostly macro level issues. So I won't get into the weeds of everything. I want to cover, again, some of the major tenets. So just to start off with a little bit of history about HBCU. So it was originally founded as the African Institute on February 25th, 1837. So that university is now called Cheney University in Cheney, Pennsylvania. And so that was actually the first HBCU founded before the Civil War. So HBCUs were primarily, most of them were primarily founded after the Civil War. And that's why a lot of them were concentrated, particularly in the southern states. So their primary purpose was to educate enslaved Blacks. So at the time, you have 4 million now free Blacks. And so one of the things that the country started to do is figure out a way to, quote, educate, or in other words, civilize these people into American mainstream society. So there are currently 101. It used to be 121, but of course, over time, some of them dissolved. And so one of the reasons HBCUs are important because they are still central to Black issues in higher education and Black social political advancement. And then some notable graduates, obviously the most recent one is Kamala Harris, our current vice president, went to Howard University. Of course, everybody know about Martin Luther King going to Morehouse, and then there's some other names there. So as you can see, HBCUs played a very important role in Black life in America. So my topic is HBCU commencement rhetoric. And so I'm particularly interested in the messages that get exchanged between the speaker and the audience at these commencement moments. So commencements are these ceremonial moments in which we gather. And commencement as a term from etymological perspective have a double meaning. It could mean the end of something or the beginning of something. So for a lot of college graduates, it's the end of the college journey, but it's also the gateway to the real world. Okay, and so I'm interested in the rhetoric that is provided throughout those particular events. Then I'm also interested in Obama's rhetorical invention. And so just to kind of put it in layman's terms, invention describes the process in which a rhetor or an orator comes about making their speech. So what are the issues here? So one, there really isn't really a lot of scholarship on HBCU discourses in general. And so for me, this was very important because I said, you know, HBCUs are central to Black social political advancement, but there hasn't really been a lot of rhetorical intention. And so I'm particularly looking at commencement addresses, but there's also pedagogical perspective, there's policy issues, there's also social issues. And so this particular project looks at just the commencement component. And then also there's limited comprehension on Obama's rhetorical invention in the presence of predominantly Black audience. So Dr. Johnson, I know, produced a piece, and there's been some other scholars who produced a piece about looking at Obama as a phenomenon, as the first African-American president. How does he speak to Black audiences? So that's one of the things I'm interested in looking at. So why study HBCU commencement rhetoric or Obama's attention? I think number one right now, particularly higher education, there's this big push for diversity, equity, inclusion, also known as DEI. And one of the things that have always been stated in the literature about HBCUs is the sense of family connection, the relational nature of HBCUs. And so by understanding how the educational experience is framed in particular epidictic moments or ceremonial moments like a commencement, we can provide pathways for administrators and academic practitioners to help understand how to improve Black retention and graduation rates. Also, this study will provide more insights into what James Jasinski calls communal exigencies. And so communal exigencies are things such as values. Okay, so what do we value? What are our community values? And so particularly we have a Black president speaking to a Black audience, what he says or does not say will determine and help us understand what are our values. Meaning and understanding is also another one that's important. So understanding what do certain terms mean, how do we understand something, particularly like the educational experience, what value does it have for us? Also identity. So another communal exigency is who are we? How do we define ourselves? And then the last one, just authority. Who do we listen to? You know, is it Obama? Is it our musicians? These are the different kind of communal exigencies in which looking at a commencement rhetoric we can engage in. Also, again, as I mentioned, there's very limited studies on Obama's rhetoric at HBCUs. There was one study that I cited in the piece, but even then it wasn't, she didn't center Obama's rhetoric at HBCUs. And then lastly, I think that this study also will help us not only understand Obama, but other Black politicians' role in terms of Black liberation. And so these are the things that, this is my rationale for why we should study this topic. So my response to the study is, I'm looking at Obama's HBCU commencement speeches during his presidency. So he gave a speech in 2010 at Hampton University. In 2013, he gave a speech at Morehouse College. And then his last speech before he exited office was Howard University. So the thing I'm particularly looking at is how HBCU commencement speeches are rhetorically constructed. In other words, what are the components that make up an HBCU commencement speech? And then once I determine what those components are, what is the meaning of those particular components? And then also I look at how Obama rhetorically constructs his rhetorical invention. So the way I approach this topic is, number one, I do a rhetorical analysis and I start with genre criticism. So genre criticism primarily looks at, for a lot of studies show that people need a frame of reference in order to understand something. And so commencement fits within the genre of other commencements. So what may happen at a PWI, which is a predominantly white institution, commencement might look different than at an HBCU commencement. So that's one of the things I kind of address in the overall piece. And so I particularly look at the structural issues. So style, language, and argument. What are the three, what is the style, the language, and the argument being conveyed at HBCU commencement? Also, Afrocentricity plays an important role in this study. Afrocentricity is essentially about placing traditional African values and beliefs in understanding Black phenomena. So because this is a Black president speaking to a Black audience at a Black institution, Afrocentricity helps me understand and get in closer proximity to understanding the cultural specific meaning of these events. And then lastly, I conduct a close reading, in particular looking at how ideology is etched into that. So again, when we talk about the rhetorical construction, how is the ideology constructed in the particular speeches? So just some, again, overall findings. So when it came to style, Obama throughout each speech kind of used this deliberative discourse. And so deliberative discourse or deliberative rhetoric is essentially where the rhetoric tries to tell the audience what they should or shouldn't do, what's in their favor. And so one of the things we noticed that throughout each speech, Obama kind of relies on a deliberative style of discourse. The language is pretty much humor and prescriptive rhetoric. So throughout each speech, Obama uses humor, particularly to open up. And then he also gives some prescription or prescribes his audience on what they should do. Now, the argument was there was a lot of use of history and by doing that to make pragmatic arguments by also using parallel case. So there was a lot of times throughout each speech, Obama would use history, right? Say, for example, at Morehouse, he would talk a little bit about how Martin Luther King and Benjamin Mays did X, and thus it is comparable to our present situation, and thus pragmatically you should follow in those footsteps. In terms of the rhetorical situation, some of the common themes when it came to the exigencies and constraints was the values, the meaning, and understanding, or the lack thereof. So exigencies are the demand on the situation, right? What's the pressing issue? And the constraints are what are the ways they get into it. And so one of the things, like for example, in the Hampton speech, that was the rise of the information age and the digital era. And so one of the things you notice Obama kind of talks about is, as long as you have the education, you will be prepared for whatever changes come about. That's one of the exigencies that existed in the speech. And then in terms of the audience, because he's speaking to primarily Black collegiate audience, they have the educational capital to advance the causes in which he is talking about. So when it comes to Afrocentricity, there are several instances of the manifestations of NOMO. So NOMO just means the generating sustaining power of the spoken word. So if you ever, so by this understanding, NOMO is an African understanding of how speech moves us. It makes us feel something. So for example, you see storytelling happens a lot, and we see this often in hip hop music. So if you ever heard a couple bars and it made your face go like, right? That's the ability of NOMO actually manifesting and playing a role in it. If any kind of words have ever made you cry, again, that is how NOMO sustains us as a community and also gives us power. Call and response is one of those things we see, particularly in the Black church. So for example, again, I'm just use hip hop. When you say, let me hear you say, hey, and then the audience responds back, that is an example of call and response. You also see mythication in there. And that's just the African understanding of myth and how myth plays a role in kind of sustaining and how we understand ourselves. So for example, someone like Harriet Tubman is a myth, not necessarily that she didn't exist, but that her ability in the to move Blacks in the progress towards liberation is kind of like mythical. It's like, wow, this woman did this for all these people. So myth plays an important role in Black understanding. Rhetorical agency also plays a role. So I use the term rhetorical agency in terms of looking at how discourse again moves, ignites agency in folks. And then also the rhetoric of collectivism plays an important role. So this idea of, hey, we are all in this together. There is no such thing as individual achievement. The concept of Ubuntu plays a big role here. And then also this rhetoric of peace and harmony. So this idea that Obama doesn't simply come to the commencement and say, congratulations on getting your degree. There's this idea that we have to say something about establishing peace and harmony within Black life. And then also Professor Cecil Blake creates this term called Afrocentric tokens, which primarily focus on race, rights, and politics. And Obama situates his rhetoric kind of in a nativist perspective. So this idea that I'm American first and then African second. Now, when it comes to close reading, one of the things that I noticed in the first speech is Obama places education as this panacea for Black folks. So this idea that if we get education, we'll solve all our problems. And so looking at how he constructs this kind of ideology, he does it in numerous ways in which I dive deep into in the overall project. In the Morehouse speech, we see that Obama is not as sympathetic to the vulnerability of Black males. And so this is something that has been kind of rise up with the work of a lot of different scholars such as Tommy Curry and a lot of other scholars who's talking about the vulnerability of Black males. So when Obama gets to Morehouse, he's essentially trying to define or redefine manhood for these Black men, which in the Black community, Morehouse is seen as like the elite all-male college. So it's like you're speaking to an audience that kind of already exudes those kind of characteristics. And then also in the Howard speech, he kind of gives this utopian idea of bipartisan politics and civil discourse. So at that time, you got to remember, this is when Black Lives Matter is on this full swing. And so Obama is trying to create this kind of discourse where he says, you know, you have to sit down with these folks and talk to them about what are your desires. But one of the things I question is how do you have equal negotiation if you're not already on equal footing with the other person? When they don't see you as human in the first place, then it's very challenging to have bipartisan politics and civil discourse. So what are the implications of deliberative discourse? So one of the things we see is that for Black, success must be contextualized with an overall schema. So in other words, Blacks must be earning a certain achievement is, while it is great individually, it means little comparative to the overall schema of Black liberation. So an example I always use, I'm a first generation. So as I go up, I still have my family who's not necessarily in the same position I am. So while we can celebrate my individual success, it's about the collective success of everyone. Which is, again, inherently tied to the future because, again, when we say, okay, I'm first generation, but my kids necessarily won't be first generation, and we keep kind of moving up towards Black liberation. And so we also see that Obama uses both his presidential persona and his cultural persona in all three of his speeches, but he is someone that wants to see him be viewed as president first, who just happens to be Black, as the other way around. When it comes to the implications for the humor and prescriptive language, what we see is that Obama attempts to be relational in nature, and HBCUs in general are relational in nature. There's this idea where even though he's the president of the United States, he wants to try to come down to the level of his audience and talk with them in a way in which they understand. And we see that throughout each speech. So again, he wants to draw this closer connection to his audience. And then also in the last speech, even though it was 2016, so at this time you have both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump jockeying for a position for the presidential race. And so what happens in this case is you see that both candidates was not favorable. And so this is why you have a lot of Blacks who kind of sat out on this election. And so what Obama was trying to do is use that prescriptive rhetoric to tell them, hey, here's how to deal with politics regardless of who is in office. So when it comes to the argument, what we see in HBCU commencements is that history plays an important role in terms of connecting the ancestors to the contemporary moment. And so what I mean by that is history is a way for us to understand how to make better decisions going forward. And so what we notice in particularly in these particular events is you see that Black folks tend to talk about the past as a way to predict the future and also have understanding on what to do and what not to do. And so again, this is where you see parallel cases argument strategies being used to make pragmatic arguments. So again, that also helps Blacks understand progress. When it comes to the rhetorical situation, as I kind of already briefly mentioned, this idea of communal values and meaning and understanding Obama tends to repeatedly address in each rhetorical situation. So again, the first speech, it's re-understanding the value of education and what it can do in terms of troubling times. When it comes to meaning and understanding, after Morehouse speech, you see Obama talks a little bit about how to understand manhood and Black masculinity. So these are things that continue to play a significant role in each of Obama's speeches. Also, the HBCU audience has the power to restore whatever communal values Obama is talking about. So when we think about a lot of our HBCU graduates, those are the people who are going to be our leaders in the community. Those are going to be our social workers, our teachers, our engineers in the Black community, and can use their educational capital to move Blacks towards liberation. Now, when it comes to Afrocentricity, we see that African cultural continuity exists. And so African cultural continuity basically means that there are some traditional African values and beliefs that have been carried on throughout generations for Black folks, Black Americans. So we see, again, the storytelling, the call and response. These are different things that, again, was not only brought over when Blacks were brought over in 1619, but these are things that continue to exist today. We also see that HBCU commencements are communal in nature. So it's about uplifting the entire community. And then also we see that, again, Obama doesn't just spend time talking about Blacks and saying, hey, congratulations on graduating, but there's a moral, ethical calling that he tends to respond to. So when it comes to like Hampton, when he has the information age and the technology, well, we know about the digital divide and how the internet is, a lot of it is created, not necessarily by people who have interest in Black liberation. And so speech for Black in the African tradition is always about ethics and the ethical practice. And then we also see that Obama is culturally connected and conscious about the Black struggle. When it comes to the close reading implications, again, Obama frames education as this way where education will solve all our Black problems. And so what ends up unfortunately happening is he misses the opportunity to respond to the structural constraints on the Black body. And then also by looking at this from a close reading perspective, I question the role of Black politicians in achieving Black liberation. So essentially my argument is when Black politicians have to focus on votes, right, they tend to do different things in order to get those votes to win. And then we have this typical argument, well, once we get in the chair, then we can make all the changes. And so that's one of the things that I'm interested in interrogating further is what role do Black politicians